My estranged wife demanded $8.5 million in cash, 50% of my software company shares, worth another $8.5 million, and my family's ranch valued at $2.3 million during our divorce proceedings, total claims exceeding $19 million, based on her argument that she had been instrumental in building everything I owned. My name is Victor Townsend, 52 years old, founder and CEO of Apex Solutions Software in Austin, Texas, with 28 years building a company that now generates $17 million in annual revenue and maintains the 340-acre ranch in the Hill Country that my grandfather left me 2 decades ago. When Michelle Townsend's attorney finished presenting her case in Travis County Family Court, complete with testimony about her sacrifices and contributions to my success, the courtroom observers and even my own legal team seemed resigned to the reality that I would be surrendering substantial portions of my life's work to settle the divorce. Michelle sat confidently at the plaintiff's table, apparently believing her attorney's aggressive strategy and fabricated timeline would overwhelm my defenses and force a settlement that would make her a multimillionaire. What Michelle and her attorney didn't know as they presented their elaborate case was that I had spent the entire proceeding waiting patiently for them to finish, knowing that the thin manila folder on my side of the courtroom table contained a single document that would reduce her $19 million in demands to exactly $0 and expose her testimony as fraudulent perjury that could result in criminal charges. The document was a premarital agreement Michelle had signed in 2012, clearly and unambiguously waiving all claims to assets I owned before our marriage, including the software company I had founded in 1997 and the ranch I had inherited in 2005. When my attorney finally opened that folder after Michelle's team had exhausted their arguments, pointed to the signature and notarization date on the premarital agreement, and handed it to Judge Catherine Morrison for review, I watched Michelle's confident expression transform into visible confusion, then dawning horror, and finally the kind of frozen panic that comes from realizing you've just committed perjury in family court while demanding millions of dollars based on claims that documentary evidence proves are completely false. Judge Morrison reviewed the premarital agreement for approximately 90 seconds in complete courtroom silence before looking up at Michelle's attorney with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering her initial assessment of the case's merits. Counsel, your client signed a premarital agreement in 2012 that explicitly waives claims to pre-existing assets, including Mr. Townsend's business and the ranch property. This document appears valid and properly executed. Why wasn't this disclosed during preliminary proceedings? Michelle's attorney, Bradford Collins, an Austin divorce specialist with a reputation for aggressive asset claims on behalf of wives, appeared genuinely shocked by the document's appearance. Your Honor, my client informed me that no premarital agreement existed. We conducted discovery based on her representations about the marriage and asset acquisition timeline. The explanation suggested that Michelle had deliberately concealed the premarital agreement's existence from her own attorney, which made her fraudulent testimony even more calculated and intentional. Judge Morrison's expression indicated she was reaching similar conclusions about the timeline manipulation and false claims that had characterized Michelle's entire case presentation. My journey to that courtroom moment had begun 28 years earlier, when I founded Apex Solutions Software in 1997 as a 24-year-old entrepreneur with software engineering background and recognition that small and medium businesses needed affordable enterprise resource planning solutions. The company I built from my apartment with $12,000 in savings had grown systematically through careful client development, strategic product evolution, and the kind of patient business building that prioritizes sustainable growth over rapid scaling. By 2005, Apex Solutions had reached $3.2 million in annual revenue, serving 147 business clients across Texas and neighboring states. The company's growth had been steady but unspectacular, reflecting my conservative approach to business expansion and my focus on profitability over growth metrics. That same year, my grandfather Harrison Townsend passed away and left me his 340-acre ranch in the Texas Hill Country, a property that had been in our family since 1947 and represented not just financial value, but generational legacy and family history. The ranch inheritance came with no mortgage, but substantial property tax obligations and maintenance costs that would have been burdensome for many people. But my software company's profitability made it feasible to maintain the property while continuing to invest in business growth. I spent weekends and vacation time at the ranch, gradually improving the facilities and infrastructure while preserving its character as working ranch land that could have been developed but that I chose to protect for future generations. By 2011, when I met Michelle Roberts at an Austin technology industry networking event, Apex Solutions had grown to $6.4 million in annual revenue with 23 employees, and the ranch had appreciated to approximately $8 million in value based on comparable hill country property sales. I was 38 years old, financially successful, and finally at a life stage where building a family seemed more important than the single-minded business focus that had characterized my 20s and early 30s. Michelle, then 34 years old, worked in marketing for a technology startup and presented herself as ambitious, independent, and interested in building a partnership with someone who shared her professional drive and values. Our relationship developed over 8 months of dating, during which I was transparent about my business ownership, the ranch property, and my intention to protect those pre-existing assets through a premarital agreement if our relationship progressed to marriage. Victor, I completely understand wanting to protect what you built before we met, Michelle had said during our conversation about premarital agreements in early 2012. I'm not marrying you for your money or your business. I want a partnership where we build our future together, and I respect that you created your success before I was part of your life. The sentiment had seemed genuine and reasonable, reflecting the kind of mature perspective I valued in a long-term partner. We engaged a family law attorney to draft a premarital agreement that was fair to both parties. I would retain ownership of pre-existing assets, including Apex Solutions and the ranch, while any assets acquired during the marriage would be community property subject to standard division if the marriage ended. Michelle would also receive spousal support if the marriage lasted more than 10 years, calculated at a reasonable rate, reflecting our lifestyle and her earning capacity. Michelle signed the premarital agreement on March 15, 2012, in the presence of a notary and 2 witnesses, after being given 2 weeks to review it with independent legal counsel at my expense. The document was properly executed, legally sound, and unambiguous in its terms. She waived all claims to Apex Solutions software, the ranch property, and any other assets I owned, as of the March 2012 signature date. We married in May 2012 in a small ceremony at the ranch, beginning what I believed would be a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. The marriage's first several years seemed to validate my assessment of Michelle as a compatible partner. She continued working in marketing roles at various Austin technology companies, while I focused on growing Apex Solutions, and we divided our time between our Austin home and weekends at the ranch. Michelle participated in some business development activities for Apex Solutions, attending client events and networking functions where having a spouse present was professionally advantageous, but her involvement was social rather than operational, and she maintained her own career rather than joining the company in any formal capacity. By 2018, Apex Solutions had grown to $12 million in annual revenue with 67 employees, and Michelle had transitioned from full-time employment to freelance marketing consulting that generated modest income while giving her more schedule flexibility. She expressed interest in focusing more on our personal life and potential family planning rather than career advancement, which I supported as a reasonable choice for someone whose spouse's income made 2 careers unnecessary for financial security. The marriage began showing strain around 2020, when business pressures from COVID-19 pandemic impacts, combined with personal stress about our unsuccessful attempts to start a family. Michelle's frustration about fertility challenges manifested in increasing criticism of my work schedule and business priorities, while I struggled to balance company survival during economic uncertainty with being emotionally present for personal challenges. We attempted marriage counseling in 2021, but the sessions revealed fundamental differences in expectations and values that proved difficult to reconcile. By early 2024, Michelle and I were effectively living separate lives while remaining legally married. She spent increasing time at the ranch while I focused on the business in Austin, and our communication had devolved into logistics and finances rather than emotional connection. I considered initiating divorce proceedings, but hesitated because the premarital agreement meant separation would be financially straightforward rather than contentious, and I hoped that space might lead to either reconciliation or mutual agreement about ending the marriage. Michelle filed for divorce in February 2025, 13 years after our marriage, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting the standard community property division that the premarital agreement specified. Her initial filing seemed consistent with the agreement we had signed. She acknowledged the premarital agreement's existence and requested division of assets acquired during the marriage, which consisted primarily of equity in our Austin home, retirement accounts, and personal property. The filing suggested an unpleasant but manageable divorce process that would leave my pre-existing business and ranch holdings intact. But 3 weeks after the initial filing, Michelle amended her divorce petition through new attorney Bradford Collins, who specialized in high-asset divorce cases and had reputation for aggressive tactics that maximized client awards. The amended petition made dramatically different claims. Michelle now asserted that she had been instrumental in building Apex Solutions software and deserved 50% ownership of the company, that she was entitled to $5 million cash settlement for unpaid contributions to business development, and that the ranch was marital property purchased as joint investment rather than pre-existing inheritance. The amended petition made no mention of the premarital agreement that directly contradicted every claim Michelle was making. When my attorney questioned Michelle's legal team about the agreement during discovery, Bradford Collins responded that Michelle disputed the document's validity and that his investigation suggested it had been signed under duress or without proper independent counsel, claims that were demonstrably false given the documented 2-week review period and Michelle's consultation with an attorney I had paid for specifically to ensure she understood the agreement before signing. Victor, Michelle's strategy is clear, my attorney explained during preparation for trial. She's hoping that claiming the premarital agreement was invalid will force you into settlement negotiations rather than risking a trial where a judge might partially credit her claims about business contributions. Even if we ultimately prevail based on the agreement, she's calculating that you'll pay substantial settlement to avoid the uncertainty and expense of litigation. The analysis was accurate about Michelle's strategy, but it underestimated my willingness to proceed to trial rather than rewarding fraudulent claims with settlement payments. I instructed my attorney that we would not negotiate any settlement that went beyond the premarital agreement's clear terms, and that I wanted Michelle's false testimony entered into court record before revealing the agreement's existence and validity. If Michelle was going to commit perjury about timeline and contributions, I wanted that perjury documented in official court proceedings, where it would have legal consequences, rather than just being negotiating tactics during settlement discussions. The divorce trial began on a Monday morning in Travis County Family Court, with Judge Catherine Morrison presiding. Bradford Collins opened with aggressive presentation of Michelle's claims, arguing that she had sacrificed her marketing career to support my business growth, that she had provided unpaid labor contributing to Apex Solutions' success, and that she deserved both ownership stake and cash compensation reflecting her contributions. Michelle Townsend gave up lucrative career opportunities to support her husband's business ambitions, Bradford argued during opening statements. She attended client events, provided marketing advice, managed household responsibilities so Victor could focus on the company, and contributed in countless ways to building Apex Solutions from a small operation to a $17 million enterprise. She deserves recognition of her partnership through ownership stake and financial compensation, not just the minimal community property division that Victor is offering. The argument sounded compelling to anyone who didn't know the actual timeline or the existence of the premarital agreement that Michelle had deliberately concealed from her attorney. Bradford's case relied on creating impression that Michelle had been present throughout Apex Solutions' growth, from founding to current success, and that her contributions had been material to that growth, rather than the social support that any spouse might provide. Michelle's testimony on the witness stand continued developing the false narrative Bradford had established. I met Victor in 2008 when Apex Solutions was just getting established, Michelle testified, moving the actual 2011 meeting date backward by 3 years. I provided marketing expertise that helped him develop client relationships and position the company for growth. I gave up my own career advancement to focus on supporting the business, and I deserve recognition for those sacrifices. The timeline manipulation was crucial to Michelle's claims because it suggested she had been involved during critical growth period when Apex Solutions expanded from startup to established business. The reality was that she met me in 2011 when the company already had $6.4 million in revenue and 19 employees, but that truth would undermine her argument about being instrumental in building the business. Tell the court about your contributions to Apex Solutions development, Bradford prompted during direct examination. Michelle had clearly rehearsed her responses. I helped Victor develop marketing strategies, attended industry events to build relationships with potential clients, provided feedback on product positioning, and managed our personal life so he could focus on growing the business. I was his partner in every sense, contributing to the company's success, even though I wasn't formally employed there. The testimony was carefully crafted to sound like material business contribution without making specific claims that could be easily disproven through documentation. Michelle's vague references to marketing strategies and feedback on product positioning were impossible to definitively refute, but also impossible to verify, creating ambiguity that might lead a judge to credit some contribution value, even if the specific claims seemed exaggerated. Bradford then moved to the ranch property claims. Mrs. Townsend, tell the court about how you and Victor acquired the Hill Country Ranch. Michelle's response demonstrated the calculated nature of her fraud. Victor and I purchased the ranch together in 2013 as an investment property and family retreat. We both contributed to the down payment from our combined savings, and we've jointly maintained and improved the property throughout our marriage. The ranch represents our shared investment and should be divided as marital property. The claim was completely false. I had inherited the ranch from my grandfather in 2005, 7 years before meeting Michelle, and 8 years before the 2013 purchase date she was claiming. But the false timeline was strategic because it placed the ranch acquisition during our marriage, which would make it community property subject to division if the premarital agreement didn't exist or was invalid. My attorney cross-examined Michelle carefully, establishing contradictions and timeline inconsistencies without revealing the premarital agreement that would ultimately demolish her entire case. Mrs. Townsend, you testified that you met Victor in 2008. Can you describe specifically where and how that meeting occurred? Michelle provided vague details about a technology industry event that couldn't be verified. It was a networking mixer for Austin tech professionals. I don't remember the exact venue or date, but I remember connecting with Victor about our shared interest in enterprise software solutions. And you began dating immediately after this 2008 meeting, my attorney continued. Michelle hesitated, recognizing the timeline trap. We started as professional acquaintances, and the relationship developed over time. I don't remember exact dates. It was a gradual progression from professional contacts to personal relationship. The vague responses revealed Michelle's awareness that specific details about the fabricated 2008 timeline would be vulnerable to documentary contradiction, but she maintained the false dating while avoiding specifics that could be disproven. My attorney continued establishing timeline questions without explaining why the dates mattered, allowing Michelle to commit to her false narrative before the premarital agreement would reveal the truth. Bradford Collins concluded Michelle's case with dramatic summation about partnership, sacrifice, and fairness. Your Honor, Michelle Townsend spent 17 years. He paused, having apparently done math based on Michelle's false 2008 timeline, rather than the actual 2011 meeting, building this empire alongside Victor. She sacrificed her career, contributed her expertise, and deserves equal ownership of the company, plus compensation for unpaid labor. The assets at issue include Apex Solutions software valued at $17 million, the Hill Country Ranch valued at $2.3 million, and additional marital assets. Michelle is requesting 50% ownership of Apex Solutions, $8.5 million cash settlement, the ranch property, and standard division of other marital assets. These requests reflect fair compensation for her contributions to building the wealth that Victor now seeks to deny her. The closing argument totaled Michelle's demands at approximately $19.3 million, when combining the company ownership stake, cash settlement, and ranch property. The courtroom observers, including several journalists covering the high-asset divorce case, seemed to assume I faced devastating financial losses based on Bradford's compelling presentation and Michelle's sympathetic testimony about sacrifice and partnership. My attorney stood to present my defense, and I watched Michelle's confident expression as she apparently believed her aggressive strategy had succeeded in overwhelming my position. Bradford had constructed an elaborate narrative of partnership and contribution that sounded convincing to anyone who didn't know the timeline was fabricated and the premarital agreement existed. Your Honor, Mr. Townsend's position is straightforward, my attorney began. He acknowledges standard community property division of assets acquired during the marriage, which he calculates at approximately $340,000 in total value split equally between the parties. However, he disputes Mrs. Townsend's claims regarding pre-existing assets and alleged business contributions. The opening was deliberately understated, giving no indication of the documentary evidence that was about to demolish Michelle's case. My attorney spent 20 minutes methodically addressing timeline claims, noting inconsistencies in Michelle's testimony, and establishing through corporate records that Apex Solutions had been founded in 1997, not just getting established in 2008 as Michelle claimed, and that county property records showed I had inherited the ranch in 2005, not purchased it jointly in 2013 as Michelle testified. These timeline discrepancies raise serious questions about Mrs. Townsend's credibility, my attorney continued, but more fundamentally they reveal deliberate misrepresentation designed to manufacture claims to assets that pre-existed the marriage. Bradford Collins objected that questioning timeline was irrelevant to determining fair asset division, which suggested he was becoming nervous about where the defense was heading. Judge Morrison overruled the objection and instructed my attorney to continue. Your Honor, I'd like to present one document that addresses all of Mrs. Townsend's claims definitively. My attorney opened the thin manila folder that had been sitting on our table throughout the trial and removed a single stapled document. This is a premarital agreement executed by Victor Townsend and Michelle Roberts, now Michelle Townsend, on March 15, 2012, properly notarized with 2 witnesses present. I'm providing copies to the court and to opposing counsel. The courtroom silence was absolute as Bradford Collins received his copy and began reading with expression that transformed from confusion to shock to barely controlled anger at his client. Michelle's face went pale as she apparently realized her concealment of the agreement's existence was about to be exposed. Judge Morrison read the document carefully, taking nearly 2 full minutes to review the terms while the courtroom waited. This appears to be a properly executed premarital agreement, Judge Morrison stated. Mrs. Townsend clearly waived claims to pre-existing assets, including the business and ranch property, with her signature notarized and witnessed. Mr. Collins, why was the court not informed of this agreement's existence during preliminary proceedings? Bradford's response revealed his recognition that his client had deceived him. Your Honor, I was not aware this document existed. My client informed me that no premarital agreement had been signed, and we proceeded with the case based on her representations. I need to request a recess to consult with my client about this development. Judge Morrison denied the recess request. The time for disclosure was during discovery, Mr. Collins. This agreement directly contradicts every major claim in your case. Mrs. Townsend testified under oath about timeline and contributions that this document proves are either irrelevant or false. The court is deeply concerned about the pattern of misrepresentation. Bradford attempted to argue that the premarital agreement might be invalid due to duress or inadequate counsel, but my attorney provided documentation showing Michelle had been given 2 weeks to review the agreement, had consulted with independent attorney at my expense, and had signed voluntarily with full understanding of its terms. The evidence of proper execution was overwhelming and completely undermined Bradford's desperate attempt to challenge the agreement's validity. Your Honor, "The premarital agreement is clear and unambiguous," Judge Morrison concluded. Mrs. Townsend waived claims to pre-existing assets, which indisputably include the business founded in 1997 and the ranch inherited in 2005. Her testimony about meeting Mr. Townsend in 2008 is contradicted by the 2012 agreement signed after they met. Her claims about jointly purchasing the ranch are contradicted by property records showing 2005 inheritance. The court finds the testimony was materially false and designed to manufacture claims that the premarital agreement explicitly bars. Michelle sat frozen at the plaintiff's table while Judge Morrison continued. The case for $8.5 million cash settlement, 50% company ownership, and ranch property is dismissed with prejudice based on the valid premarital agreement. Mrs. Townsend is entitled only to standard community property division of assets acquired during marriage, which Mr. Townsend calculates at $340,000 total value. The court finds this calculation reasonable and orders equal division, $170,000 to each party. The ruling transformed Michelle's $19.3 million in demands into $170,000 actual award, reducing her claims by more than 99% through the single document she had concealed from her attorney and lied about under oath. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. The court is further concerned about the false testimony regarding timeline and contributions. "Mrs. Townsend, you testified under oath that you met Mr. Townsend in 2008 and that you jointly purchased the ranch in 2013. Both claims are demonstrably false and appear designed to create fraudulent basis for asset claims. The court is referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for review regarding potential perjury charges." Michelle's face reflected absolute horror at the mention of criminal referral. Bradford Collins attempted to argue that timeline confusion shouldn't be treated as criminal perjury, but Judge Morrison was unmoved. "Mr. Collins, your client didn't just confuse dates. She constructed an elaborate false narrative, moving her meeting with Mr. Townsend backward 3 years, and claiming the ranch was purchased jointly when property records prove it was inherited before she met him. This wasn't innocent error. It was calculated fraud designed to manufacture multi-million-dollar claims. The court will not ignore perjury simply because it occurred in civil proceedings." Judge Morrison then addressed the legal fees that had accumulated during the multi-day trial. Mr. Townsend was forced to defend against claims that a properly executed premarital agreement explicitly barred. Mrs. Townsend's concealment of that agreement and false testimony extended litigation unnecessarily and forced Mr. Townsend to incur substantial legal expenses defending against fraudulent claims. The court orders Mrs. Townsend to reimburse Mr. Townsend's reasonable legal fees. "My attorney submitted documentation showing $127,000 in legal fees incurred defending against Michelle's claims, and Judge Morrison ordered Michelle to pay the full amount within 90 days. The financial impact meant Michelle would receive $170,000 from Community Property Division, but owe $127,000 in legal fees, netting approximately $43,000 from a divorce where she had demanded $19.3 million. The courtroom cleared slowly as journalists recognized the dramatic reversal and began preparing stories about the divorce case that collapsed when the wife's false testimony met documented reality. Bradford Collins left quickly without speaking to reporters, while Michelle sat at the plaintiff's table, appearing stunned by how completely her strategy had failed. "I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon with complete victory. 100% ownership of Apex Solutions software retained, the family ranch property protected, and legal fees awarded that meant Michelle would bear the financial cost of her fraudulent claims. The premarital agreement I had carefully negotiated 13 years earlier had functioned exactly as intended, protecting pre-existing assets from divorce claims while ensuring fair division of marital property. The aftermath of the trial brought consequences for Michelle beyond the financial losses and perjury referral. The Travis County District Attorney's Office reviewed Judge Morrison's referral and concluded that while Michelle's testimony was clearly false, prosecuting perjury in civil divorce cases was typically reserved for the most egregious situations. They declined criminal charges, but issued formal warning that any future false testimony would result in prosecution, a permanent record that would follow Michelle if she ever testified in legal proceedings again. Bradford Collins faced professional review by the Texas State Bar for failing to verify basic facts before presenting fraudulent claims in court. The bar investigation concluded that while Collins had been misled by his client, competent attorneys have duty to independently verify major factual claims, rather than relying solely on client representations, particularly when documentary evidence like premarital agreements should have been disclosed during discovery. He received formal reprimand and was required to complete additional professional responsibility education, damaging his reputation among high-asset divorce clients who valued both aggressive advocacy and professional competence. Michelle's reputation within our Austin social and professional circles collapsed as details of the trial spread through community networks. The story of wife demands $19 million based on false timeline, defeated by prenup she concealed, became cautionary tale shared at social gatherings and professional events, transforming Michelle from sympathetic divorcing spouse into example of how fraud in divorce proceedings destroys credibility and results in worse outcomes than honest negotiation would have produced. I heard Michelle Townsend tried to claim she'd been with Victor since 2008 and deserved half his company, became typical conversation at Austin technology industry events where both Michelle and I had professional connections. Turns out she didn't meet him until 2011, and she'd signed a prenup giving up all claims to his pre-existing assets. The judge dismissed her entire case and made her pay Victor's legal fees. She walked away with basically nothing after demanding $19 million. Several former friends and professional contacts reached out to me expressing shock at Michelle's litigation strategy and apologizing for having initially sympathized with her divorce claims before learning the full truth. Victor, I had no idea Michelle was making completely false claims about timeline and contributions, was the common theme in these conversations. When I heard she was getting divorced and asking for fair division, I assumed she had legitimate claims. I didn't realize she was trying to take assets you built before you even met her. The professional validation was meaningful, but secondary to the fundamental satisfaction of having protected assets through careful planning and documentation. The premarital agreement I negotiated in 2012 had seemed like simple, prudent planning at the time, but it proved to be the strategic decision that prevented Michelle from succeeding in her attempt to claim half of everything I had built across 28 years of systematic business development. Standing in my office at Apex Solutions 6 months after the trial, I reflected on how Michelle's demand for $19, $3 million had been reduced to $43,000 net recovery through the power of documented agreements, and her catastrophic decision to commit perjury about timeline rather than negotiating honestly within the constraints the premarital agreement established. Her strategy of concealing the agreement and fabricating timeline had been designed to create settlement pressure, but it had instead resulted in complete legal defeat and permanent reputation damage that made the outcome worse than if she had simply acknowledged the prenup from the beginning. That premarital agreement was the best legal decision you ever made, my attorney observed during our final meeting to close the case file. Michelle's entire strategy depended on you either not having that agreement or having it be defective in some way that would let her challenge it. When you produced a properly executed agreement that she'd signed after full review with independent counsel, her entire case collapsed instantly. The observation captured the essential lesson about relationship documentation and legal protection of pre-existing assets. High-value individuals entering marriages need to protect wealth accumulated before relationships begin, and properly executed premarital agreements provide that protection in ways that eliminate ambiguity and prevent the kind of false claims Michelle attempted. What surprised me most was Michelle's willingness to commit obvious perjury about timeline, my attorney continued. Moving your meeting date backward 3 years and claiming you jointly purchased inherited property wasn't subtle misrepresentation. It was blatant fraud that was easily disprovable. She must have believed you wouldn't have documentation or that judges don't verify facts carefully. I explained that Michelle's strategy reflected her fundamental misunderstanding of how I approached both business and personal matters. I document everything: business transactions, property acquisitions, major life events, legal agreements. Michelle lived with me for 13 years and apparently never recognized that the same systematic documentation that built Apex Solutions would protect me in divorce proceedings. She assumed she could create false narrative because she didn't understand that I would have the receipts. The phrase, having the receipts, had become shorthand for possessing documentary evidence that defeats false claims, and my case with Michelle was textbook example of how proper documentation transforms he said she said disputes into objective fact determination. Michelle's testimony about 2008 meeting and 2013 ranch purchase wasn't credible opinion that a judge needed to evaluate. It was objectively false claim contradicted by notarized agreements and public property records. The business continuity that the premarital agreement protected was perhaps the most significant outcome beyond the financial victory. If Michelle had succeeded in claiming 50% ownership of Apex Solutions, the company's operations would have been disrupted by ownership disputes. Key employees would have been uncertain about future direction, and clients would have questioned stability during ownership transition. The agreement's protection of my 100% ownership meant none of those disruptions occurred, and Apex Solutions continued operating normally throughout the divorce proceedings. Did the divorce trial affect company morale or operations? Asked one of my senior managers during a leadership team meeting several weeks after the case concluded. We heard rumors about major demands from Michelle, but you never seemed concerned. I explained that I had been confident throughout the proceedings because the premarital agreement was clear and valid. Michelle made aggressive demands based on false timeline claims, but I knew she had signed away rights to pre-existing assets. The trial was unpleasant, but I was never worried about losing the company because proper documentation from 2012 protected it. The lesson for all of you is that legal agreements matter. If you're building valuable assets, protect them properly before entering relationships where divorce could threaten what you've built. The ranch property that Michelle had tried to claim as jointly purchased investment remained securely in my ownership as my grandfather had intended when he left it to me 2 decades earlier. The 340 acres of hill country land represented not just financial value, but family legacy and generational connection that would have been desecrated if Michelle had succeeded in forcing its sale or claiming half ownership. The premarital agreement's protection of inherited property specifically meant my grandfather's legacy was preserved despite Michelle's fraudulent claims. I spent a weekend at the ranch several weeks after the trial concluded, walking the property boundaries and reflecting on how close Michelle's fraud had come to forcing sale of land that had been in my family for 3 generations. The oak trees my grandfather had planted in the 1950s, the creek that ran through the south pasture, the century-old stone barn that we'd restored together before his death, all of these would have been liquidated and the proceeds divided if Michelle's timeline fabrications had succeeded. Your grandfather would be proud of how you protected the ranch, my father commented during a phone call about the trial outcome. He wanted that land to stay in our family, and you made sure it did by being smart enough to get the prenup before you married. Michelle's attempt to steal inherited property through false testimony about joint purchase was disgraceful, but you had the documentation that defeated her fraud. The family validation mattered more than the financial victory in some ways, because protecting inherited property was about honoring family legacy rather than just preserving personal wealth. My grandfather had worked that ranch for 50 years before leaving it to me, and Michelle's 14 years of marriage didn't create claim to 3 generations of family history, regardless of what false timeline she testified about. The $340,000 in actual community property that Michelle received as her share, consisting primarily of equity in our Austin home, retirement account contributions during marriage, and personal property, represented exactly what the premarital agreement specified she would get: fair division of assets accumulated during marriage. If she had approached the divorce honestly and negotiated reasonably within the agreement's framework, she would have received the same $170,000 without incurring $127,000 in legal fee liability that reduced her net recovery to $43,000. Michelle would have been better off accepting the prenup terms from the start instead of trying to break it through fraud, observed one of the financial advisors who helped me manage the divorce asset calculations. She spent tens of thousands on legal fees, damaged her reputation permanently, faces potential criminal record for perjury, and ended up with basically nothing after demanding $19 million. That's one of the worst litigation strategy failures I've ever seen. The analysis was accurate but missed the psychological dimension of Michelle's choices. Her decision to fabricate timeline and commit perjury wasn't rational litigation strategy. It was emotional reaction to feeling entitled to wealth she hadn't earned and refusing to accept that the premarital agreement legitimately limited her claims. She believed that aggressive demands and false testimony would create settlement pressure, not recognizing that proper documentation would expose her fraud and lead to complete defeat. The speaking opportunities that resulted from my divorce case brought requests from family law organizations, estate planning groups, and wealth management conferences interested in using my experience as case study about protecting pre-existing assets. The presentations I delivered emphasized 3 key lessons. Properly executed premarital agreements are legally enforceable protection for pre-existing wealth. Systematic documentation of assets and timeline defeats false claims, and attempting to overcome valid agreements through fraud typically results in worse outcomes than honest negotiation would produce. Victor Townsend's case demonstrates why high-net-worth individuals must protect pre-existing assets before marriage, noted my presentation at a Texas estate planning conference. His wife demanded $19 million based on fabricated timeline, claiming she'd been involved in building his business since 2008. One document, a properly executed premarital agreement from 2012, reduced those demands to 0 and exposed the timeline fraud. The lesson is clear. Protect your assets before marriage, document everything carefully, and don't negotiate with fraudulent demands when you have documentation that defeats them. The professional expertise I developed through experiencing divorce litigation generated consulting requests from other business owners facing similar situations where spouses were making claims to pre-existing businesses or inherited property. The advice I provided emphasized the importance of proper documentation, the value of patience in letting false claims be fully developed before revealing documentary evidence, and the willingness to proceed to trial rather than settling fraudulent demands just to avoid litigation. My ex-wife is claiming she helped build my business, even though I started it 10 years before we met, was typical consultation scenario. Her attorney is demanding 30% ownership plus cash settlement. I have a prenup, but they're claiming it's invalid. Should I settle to avoid trial? My response in these situations drew from my Michelle experience. If you have properly executed premarital agreement, don't settle fraudulent claims that the agreement explicitly bars. Let them present their entire case in court. Then produce the agreement and watch the judge dismiss their claims. Settling rewards fraud and teaches your ex-spouse that making false demands creates settlement pressure. Going to trial with solid documentation teaches the opposite lesson and often results in fee awards that make the fraud expensive for the person who attempted it. The strategic advice about letting fraudulent claims be fully developed before revealing documentary defenses was counterintuitive to many people who wanted to immediately disprove false testimony. But my experience proved that allowing lies to be entered into court record under oath created stronger foundation for sanctions and fee awards than simply contradicting claims during initial proceedings. Why did you wait until after Michelle's entire case was presented to reveal the prenup? Was common question during presentations. Why not just produce it immediately and avoid the multi-day trial? The answer reflected strategic calculation about creating complete record of fraud. If I'd revealed the premarital agreement immediately, Michelle could have claimed she'd made honest mistake about timeline or didn't remember exact dates of events from years ago. By letting her present elaborate false testimony about 2008 meeting, joint ranch purchase and business contributions, I created detailed record of intentional fraud that couldn't be dismissed as innocent confusion. That record supported the judge's perjury referral and fee award in ways that early disclosure wouldn't have accomplished. 6 months after the trial, I reflected on how the divorce experience had validated every careful decision I'd made about documentation and legal protection throughout my adult life. The systematic approach to record keeping that built Apex Solutions, documenting every major business decision, maintaining corporate records meticulously, protecting intellectual property properly, had extended to personal life through premarital agreement that protected pre-existing wealth. Michelle's assumption that she could overcome that documentation through false testimony had been catastrophically wrong, and the consequences she faced were a direct result of choosing fraud over honest negotiation. The thin manila folder that had contained the premarital agreement remained on my desk as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful legal weapons are simple documents properly executed and carefully preserved. Michelle's attorney had constructed an elaborate case with testimony, timelines, and demand calculations that filled hundreds of pages of court filings. My defense had consisted of one document, properly signed and notarized 13 years earlier, that reduced all her claims to zero. Have you ever faced demands for assets based on fabricated claims and discovered that proper documentation reduces elaborate lies to dismissed cases? Wealth protection sometimes requires recognizing that careful planning before relationships begin provides security that no amount of negotiation after relationships end can replicate, and that people who commit perjury to claim assets they never earned deserve complete legal defeat rather than settlement compromise. If this story of premarital agreements, timeline fraud, and the power of documentation resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button to Revenge Tales with Luke. Share your experiences with protecting assets, facing false claims in legal proceedings, and the importance of proper documentation in relationships and business. See you in our next story.